Welcome back, AP. All right. Good job today in class. Really impressed with your ability to review. Really love the amount of information y'all retained from those two flips over break. And great news that's actually out here right now is that we are actually slightly ahead of schedule. I know, it blows my mind that right now we are ahead of schedule by the comparison where we were last year. So we're moving really expeditiously. We're doing a really good job. We're going forward, and we're now going to be starting a unit that a lot of people really enjoy. We're not starting a unit. We're now in a unit a lot of people really enjoy because a lot of it is much more cause and effect. Storyline and flow, like going in, it was this, now it's this, right? So going into it, we talked mostly in the last two flips about the growing economic dominance in worldwide trade by particularly Great Britain, but also by Europeans in general. And then we also began to talk about the expansion over the seas. We talked about like the growth of the British Navy. We talked about the growth of trade during that time period. We also talked about, like yesterday in class, the growth of the Atlantic slave trade as a result of that trade growth, right? And we talked a lot of different stuff about the semantics of that, how it worked and things like that, and how it's literally an awful piece of history, and why we should stop looking for heroes throughout history. But the big thing that we're now moving into is we're going to talk about how the expansion of all that trade and the expansion of the putting out system and the expansion of the agricultural system is going to lead to changing lives of people in the 1700s. That's right. For once, we're talking about like regular folks. And so to give you a sense of how to like decode this flip and this Prezi, this is going to be a little thing that I constantly use, right? You're going to see a lot of red arrows in this Prezi. So we're going to be talking about what it was or what it used to be, like in a sense of like how people's lives were this way before about give or take 1650. And then the red arrow is going to indicate change, as in enlightenment, new economics, or the expansion of trade. That's your change, and this is going to be what it's going to become, okay? So getting into it a little bit, the first thing we like to start off with is we love to start off with talking about the changing lives of people when we talk about marriage and family life, right? So when we're getting into it, people during this time period, going into the 1700s, the dynamics of urban and rural settings when it comes to marriage and family life and also the structure of a regular everyday life is going to change dramatically. People first and foremost are going to start getting married later in life, right? So instead of getting married super young and having your marriage actually like set up by your parents and having it arranged, this marriage later in life is going to actually become very prominent. This is brought on mostly by new economic patterns. So villages wanted to limit the number of new marriages for one particular reason, because they didn't need as many children, right? So due to the advancements of the agricultural revolution, the seed drill by Jethro Tull, the crop rotations and things like that, you did not require as many people to work a certain amount of land. So it did not become nearly as advantageous anymore to have a slew of children that you hoped lived long enough to be able to help you with work and things like that, right? So villages, because of this, do not want to overpopulate themselves, dilute their money, and dilute their way intake. They want to be able to actually manage the number of new marriages. So the average age of marriage actually rose to about 25 to 27. And the only way to marry was to prove that you could be prosperous with your new spouse, right? So that's right, we're now starting to get married for what? For love, right? We're getting married for love instead of a marriage for arrangement or an economic pattern, right? So this is going to lead to the concept of the nuclear family, as in a mom, a dad, and a couple of children, not a ton of children, right? Maybe, possibly, you got grandma and grandpa living with you because they're older and they need to be taken care of and things like that. But you're leading to the adoption of this now prototypical nuclear family that even exists in the modern era, right? So because of this, though, also, you have to understand as well that because of these patterns, because villages are looking to limit the number of like growing families, villages are trying to make sure that they are appropriately farming the amount of like land that is being left behind by the agricultural revolution and things like that. You also have to understand that as the number of villagers began to grow, because we do know that population is beginning to increase as well, that work is starting to have to be acquired outside of the village and outside of the home, right? So many young people start moving into cities to try and find work as well. So in the in the late 1600s, getting into the 1700s, you got people getting married later in life. They're getting married for love. They're actually creating a nuclear family. They're proving to dads, being like, do I have your permission to marry your daughter? Because look, I have some money stowed away and I can actually farm this amount of land and keep us economically stable. And he's like, yes, you may, blah, 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 blah. And so dowries are starting to go down and things like that. But because of this, there's only so much land to farm. So as the years kept progressing, some young people had to go find work outside of the home, and they had to move into cities to go off and find this work, right? You had some young men going off and becoming apprentices of certain crafts like workers, and also in the guilds as they were beginning to die, right? So they were like, oh, I'll go and get a job in a guild in Paris or something like that, or I'll go to a major city and get a job there. You had women as well finding work outside of the home. They were going to wealthy families and trying to become nannies or stewardesses or things like, not stewardesses, like nannies or housekeepers or seamstresses inside of cities as well was a very, very big job for women as well. Now, the big thing about it, though, is let's see how that's going to dynamically change the lives of people, right? Because before this happened, during this era, there were these things called community controls. So in the early 1700s, before these like big movements of people into cities to find work after the agricultural revolution, before these young people are starting to find work outside their home and moving into cities, right? There were cooperative patterns of moral and social economic standards in rural villages. Now, what I mean by that is it was like takes a village to raise a child kind of sense, right? You had certain standards that everyone had to follow suit with, right? You had parents there to chaperone their kids to make sure that their relationship was staying pious and pure before they got married, right? You had all of these different like social and economic standards being forced upon by the village itself, right? One of the best examples that I'm getting at is this thing called the donkey rides. So for example, in many English villages, if you were caught abusing or beating your wife, you would be forced to ride a donkey backwards and holding his tail up while your like fellow villagers yelled and screamed things at you and possibly threw things at you, right? To embarrass you, to show you that you do not do that to your wife and you do not physically abuse your family. And so, like, that is an example of a community control, right? They prevent, like, you had to ask a father's permission to be able to get married. That's an example of a community control, right? You have all these different community controls that existed. But then, once this starts happening, once work starts being acquired outside the home, things changed. And we saw in Europe the explosion in about 1700 of this thing known as illegitimacy, right? So the illegitimacy explosion was in the later half of the 1700s, things got crazy. Men and women were now leaving home. They are now leaving these villages. They are now going off and finding work somewhere and flooding into the cities. And so what's happening is, without any supervision, without any like understandable like community controls to keep them like oriented and like keep them like where they're supposed to be, you're going to see a massive explosion in illegitimate births, right? So you're going to see men and women having children that weren't married, right? So like men and women are now leaving home. They're working for a wage. They're flooding into the cities. In 1700 in German cities, 2% of births were illegitimate. By 1850, 25% of them are illegitimate, right? That's the height of the Industrial Revolution in Germany. So you went from 2% to 1 out of every 4. You went 2 out of 100 to 1 out of every 4 births in Germany were illegitimate, like illegitimate births. And a lot of this has a lot of different prices, right? There's a tons of different whys as to why this happened. So, like, one big reason is a rise in prices, okay? So since prices are going up, men are actually committing to these relationships, realizing that they can't afford them or can't afford to take care of a family, so they're bailing on a woman after they get pregnant, right? You also have less control of young people who are supposed to be waiting around until their 20s to get married, right? So, like, which, as we know from society, is a very difficult thing to do, to try and get, like, 20-year-olds to act the way they're supposed to, right? So now, the big thing about it, though, is you are seeing a massive growth in this illegitimacy explosion. So as you can see, though, the big thing to garner from that last slide is that we used to live in villages where everybody was cooperative. Now we're moving into cities where it's almost every man for himself, right? Now, since we have an illegitimacy explosion, that means we have a lot of kids running around now, right? So we have children, and education is going to become a major facet as well of the pre- and post-Enlightenment, pre- and post-New Economics era. Now, the Enlightenment affects this piece way more than anything else does. The Enlightenment has a direct effect on the education of children and childhood education, and also the view of children during the 1700s, right? So first and foremost, just so you know, going back to the community controls, going back to the illegitimacy explosion, all that stuff, even though 1 out of every 4 births by 1850 were like illegitimate, even though you had a growth in illegitimate births going on, right, during this time period, because like even before that, even during community controls, just to give you a heads up, In community control eras, there were 20% by 1700, even if you lived in a village, about 20% of mothers were expecting when they got married, when they were getting married in these villages, right? So you have a heavy amount of births happening right now. A lot of that also relates to better crops coming in, better diets, things like that. So people have the health ability to get pregnant more often, right? So with that, though, you also have to understand infant mortality still very, very high, right? So like 7 out of 10 births literally resulted in the death of the mother or the child by 1700, and also by 1700. Most kids did not live to see their 10th birthday, right? So a lot of this has to do with disease, poverty, and children are still very, very vulnerable to these diseases and poverty, even going into adolescence. So with these new children running around, you've got two different types of mothers on the rise. You have urban mothers and you have rural mothers, right? Urban mothers are going to turn to this thing called wet nursing, which became very popular with the growth of the number of children and the number of mothers that exist during this time period. What wet nursing is when a woman nurses a child that isn't hers, right? So basically what was going on is urban women believed that nursing your child was kind of like gross and unbecoming and something poor people did, which is actually not the case at all, but we're not going to get into that right now. But they basically were like, oh, I'm not nursing my own child. That's gross, right? And they also did not know that there were baby formula options. They had no idea about these other options that we have in the modern era. So wealthy and working women in cities started literally just sending their children off to get nurse with another woman, right? Now, a big example of this is in France. In France, the huge majority of women, over 50% of urban women, had a wet nurse on staff or were sending their children into the countryside to nurse from another woman, right? So nursing your child, though, which is what rural women did, actually helped save lives. So this is one of those interesting little points in history where the urban women and the women in cultural centers and cities are way wrong. Because nursing a child helps save lives. It helps prevent pregnancy going forward due to the fact that as a child nurses, the hormones that produce the eggs and also make pregnancy possible actually limits themselves during that nursing. And then also the child receiving certain positive bacteria and positive immuno options from their mother helps prevent disease from that child and helps keep that child alive longer. This is most often, though, nursing your child was most often practiced in poorer communities. Now, wet nursing, though, is also very dangerous. You had to take a newborn child and ship them out to the country if you were a working woman, because these urban women weren't all necessarily wealthy. Wealthy women had wet nurses come to them, but working women inside of places like France and Germany and England had to send their children out to the countryside to be wet nursed, right? 55% of French children died before the age of 10. A lot of that is associated with poor nutrition. The wet nurses that they're going to have too many kids and clients, so they actually aren't producing enough milk to feed that child and keep them healthy. 30% of children die before the age of 10 in England. So as you can see, France made it very popular for wet nursing. England, not as much, but France is probably the worst out of all the countries. And where are most of our Enlightenment thinkers from? France, right? So Enlightenment thinkers railed against wet nursing. They were like, you are killing your children. You are destroying their ability to live. You are destroying their ability to actually go forward. You had the child. You need to keep them safe and you need to keep them healthy. So, oh, poor little baby. Now, Enlightenment thinkers are going to rail against this. And then also what's happening, though, is because of the growth of wet nursing, because of all these different things, these rural women made money off of wet nursing. So these wet nurses needed to keep their clientele base at a certain population. A woman could only take on about 5 to 6 clients, and she made good money off of that. But the problem is what if that woman, because we're still in the middle of this illegitimacy explosion, what if that woman gets pregnant with her own child now? What is she going to do? Is she going to feed her child and then get rid of one of her clients? But then she'd be losing money. So what you saw in Europe during the 1700s was a growth in this thing called infanticide, which is when rural women would literally kill their own children to try and make it so they could keep nursing other women's children. They literally referred to it as a plague amongst women in France because they were literally killing their own children. So what is the French government, post-Enlightenment, going to do to try and help prevent this from happening? foundling hospitals, right? So what ends up happening is France, because it has such a wet nursing issue, and because it has all of these Enlightenment thinkers running around saying that they're railing against these things, foundling hospitals become very, very big. Foundling hospitals are orphanages where women who are from the rural community that are these wet nurses, if they get pregnant and give birth and the child survives, they can take their child to a foundling hospital, and the foundling hospital will try their best to take care of them. But then the really sad part about it is the foundling hospitals didn't have enough wet nurses or enough people to feed the children, so 50 to as far as 90% of some foundling hospitals' children are actually going to die as well. So this is ridiculous. So as you can tell, the attitudes towards raising children needed to drastically change. And so what's going to happen is you're going to see the Enlightenment thinkers start proposing the idea of, what are y'all doing? You've got rich women forcing poor women to feed their children. You've got poor women killing their children so they can keep making money. You've got foundling hospitals that are grossly understaffed and don't have the medical expertise to keep these kids alive. And so what's going to happen is they're going to start moving towards Enlightenment tenderness of raising children. So Enlightenment, one of the biggest things about the Enlightenment is that it had a positive effect on the raising of children. So there used to be this old adage in like English villages and things like that. There was a saying that said, spare the rod, spoil the child. As in, if you don't beat your kid with a stick, you're going to spoil them. So you need to actually like make sure you're punishing your child physically. This is the attitude towards children pre-Enlightenment. But post-Enlightenment is more, let your child live. Let them explore. Let them dig in the dirt. Let them be a child. Let their brains grow and educate them. And so the Enlightenment thinkers are going to be like, wet nursing, terrible idea. Stop doing that. Foundling hospitals, terrible idea. Let's stop doing that. Well, Rousseau didn't think that, but we'll get there. So like Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, even though he like advocated for the like education of children and stuff, he actually gave all 5 of his daughters to foundling hospitals, and he literally was a part of that illegitimacy explosion because all 5 of his children were illegitimate. So like now the big thing about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, now like the big thing though, also Enlightenment thinkers got so upset about this. Look at these children wearing tight, constricted clothes. These daughters are wearing corsets and they're no older than the age of 10. This is the era of the pre-Enlightenment child. And then the post-Enlightenment child comes up, and this is what they believe for their children. Let them wear big, flowy clothes. Let them run around naked with no pants on. They're babies, right? Let them have little walkers where you teach them to stand. Let them be explorative. Let them be babies. Let them be children. Stop putting them in whalebone corsets, right? And this is going to lead to the spread of elementary education throughout many different areas of Europe as well. So like with this, the Enlightenment and all these things are helping spread positivity in the era of the Enlightenment to actually raise your children a little bit better. And then also, we got to talk a little bit about, last little thing we'll talk about before we like let you go, is we got to talk about like pop culture in the 1700s, right? So the big thing that's going to blow up in the 1700s is reading, okay? So we talked about how men and women are moving into cities. We talked about community controls are gone, illegitimacy explosion. We talked about infanticide, foundling hospitals, wet nursing, and all these other big things that were happening in the 1700s to regular people. Well, another big thing that was happening to regular people is the growth in literacy rates. In 1600, only 1 out of every 6 European citizens could read. By 1800, 9 out of every 10 European citizens can read. So as you can see, there is going to be exposure to more written and readable materials during this time period. One of the big ones, of course, pamphlets, right? Thank you, printing press, for making pamphlets such a big deal. Pamphlets become super popular and easy to read and easy to acquire. And also these things called chapbooks. Chapbooks means cheap books, or books made out of paper pulp and cheaper materials. So they made novels. They wrote fiction now. They started writing folklore and old stories that were spread through the villages. They also start writing DIY manuals and almanacs, and poor people have access to these things. And then one of the biggest deals ever, the newspaper. The very first newspaper starts being published in Augsburg, Germany in the 1680s, and then later on you've got the People's Friend in France, and then by 1700 you have one in Vienna, so people can buy a cheap newspaper printed on pulpy, cheap material that they can literally look and understand what's going on in their lives, right? The newspaper becomes big. Enlightenment ideas are going to spread because of this boom in reading. Now I can go read Descartes, I can go read John Locke, I can go read these things because literacy is blowing up in these different ideas. And new economic patterns are also going to free up time for recreation. So because of this, you can choose to work a little bit more industrious revolution style so you can buy more things, or you can choose to go do something for fun for once. So you're going to see people with downtime start to grow, and recreation becomes very, very popular. If you were typically in a village, in villages you usually went to a pub or a home gathering. So in general, whenever you lived in a village, every village was considered to have like a pub or a restaurant or a public house that was nearby. And that's what pub is short for, is a public house. Most English villages were always said that you're not truly a village if you don't have a pub, right? And men would actually go there during their downtime and have a drink or play cards and gamble and enjoy themselves. Or you would have home gatherings and really large festivals and big group area like celebrations inside of other like villages in general. You would have massive celebrations and different like festivals. And then in urban areas and towns, you saw sports on the rise. You saw horse racing becoming very, very big. Boxing as well. And boxing, by the way, is not boxing with gloves. It's bare knuckle boxing. It's like watching two dock workers beat the ever-loving daylights out of each other. You saw the theater growing, public fairs. You also saw the growth in this thing called blood sports, right? Blood sports were ways that people could go and actually like spend their money in a little bit of a different way, and they could basically end up going, let me zoom in a little bit. Can I zoom in a little bit? No, maybe? Oh, there it goes. Blood sports were a big thing where people would go to these big events and they would actually watch people fight each other like boxing, or they would watch this thing known as bull baiting or bear baiting or cockfighting, and what they would do is they would basically, in a nutshell, bet on these sports that would lead to someone being hurt or an animal's death. And so like this kept them like recreatively entertained and stuff like that. This replaced Netflix. Blood sports were bigger than Netflix early on. So another big thing going into it is what they are. Cockfighting was watching two roosters fight. Bull baiting is when a bull was tied to a stick and then dogs were released on it so that they could actually see if the bull would kill how many dogs before they actually pulled the bull down, right? So boxing was big for the wealthy and things like that. Bear baiting was the exact same kind of concept, but that is actually why you got the origin of the English bulldog. The English bulldog comes from the fact that those dogs were bred specifically to fight bears and bulls in these bull and bear fighting rings. And so they had these short snouts that angled backwards, so when they grabbed onto something, they could keep breathing without letting go. So like blood sports becomes big. Recreation is becoming huge. You can go to your pub in your village. You can go to your home gathering. And then also another big one, Carnival, aka Mardi Gras, right? So Mardi Gras and Carnival become a huge amount of festivals, or a huge festival idea in Catholic cities throughout all of Europe. Mostly in Italy, but Catholic cities really begin to gravitate to the idea of the Mardi Gras or the Carnival, and they start having these massive city-wide celebrations to celebrate the upcoming of Lent, right? So as you can see, people's lives are drastically changing, and I hope you all enjoyed all that stuff, because now in our next class we're going to be talking about we're going to talk about consumerism. We're going to talk about fashion and how that changed a lot. We're going to talk about a lot of different other little elements, but I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.